Good morning, everyone. Thank you, as always, for joining our monthly webinar. We have a lot of people here gathered today, so that's great, but I'm still going to invite questions as we go through. Just put it in the Q&A. If we get too many, I will stay on as long as we need to at the end to answer all the questions that we get, because this is some new material that we're covering. For those of you who attend all the time, wonderful. For those of you who don't, we do these compliance webinars on the on the second Thursday of the month, typically, except for next month. So for all of you in attendance, we are doing a seminar at Narcisse Winery next month in August. It's a beautiful venue. Come for the food and drink, even if you're not particularly interested in compliance, come anyway. And it's just a wonderful venue, and we'll be covering some more HR topics. I'm Ann Lavelle. If you don't know me already, I am the compliance specialist for CTR. I spent about the first 25 years of my career as a partner in a really large firm in downtown Pittsburgh, doing employer side, management side, labor and employment law. And I retired, and I was happy in my bunny slippers, but was asked to do this. And I really love the educational component of things. And so this was a wonderful opportunity. So we do these once a month, usually as a webinar, except for about 2 times a year, we do seminars that you can attend, and there's free food and drink. And again, next month in August, we'll be at Narcisse Winery, which is out in the North Hills. And it's just a wonderful location. So I hope to see everybody there. As just some housekeeping, this is being recorded, and the recording along with the slides will be sent to everybody. I don't do that because I'm like a technical jinx, but that will be sent out by our team here, along with the SHRM code if you need that for SHRM credit for this webinar. So let's talk a little bit about how this webinar is set up today. I'm going to cover the new material first. So we're going to talk first about the new quirks to the City of Pittsburgh Sick Days Act. And that way, if you're really familiar with this and you're like, oh, it's been around since 2015, I got this. That way you can hear the new stuff, and we're not tying up your whole day listening to some of the other material, which is a little bit of a primer and going back to basics to say, hey, this is a reminder of how this is supposed to work in the first place. And now you have to add the new stuff onto it. So for those of you who've been around the block multiple times and already have a good handle on the City of Pittsburgh or the Allegheny County sick leave law, we're going to cover the new stuff first so that you can just get your arms around that. And then please feel free to hang on and listen to the rest of the webinar. And we'll cover, again, some of the key components of these 2 acts, because the 2 acts are basically the same except for the new stuff. All right. So what is new? The law is always changing, right? So these changes, first of all, go into effect on January 1st of next year. You have 6 months to prepare. So you have a running head start here to say, okay, I know what I'm going to have to do. That helps with budgeting, because HR folks always have to, you wear so many hats, right? You always have to be accountable for the budget for HR and what is this going to cost in terms of human capital. And so this allows you to plan ahead for the next 6 months. The first thing that's changing is the accrual methodology. So this is only changing for the City of Pittsburgh Sick Days Act. I just said a few minutes ago that the Allegheny County sick day leave law mirrors the City of Pittsburgh. It continues to mirror, they continue to mirror each other, except for the things that are new. So it used to be, if you complied with one, you complied with both. You couldn't mess it up. If you were good for one, you were good for the other. That is no longer true. The City of Pittsburgh is now more generous than Allegheny County in terms of their paid sick day acts and ordinances. Okay, so the first one is the methodology is changing of how it accrues. And we'll talk about later, because this was true prior to the new stuff, whether you do an accrual method or you front load. But the methodology, if you're have your employees accruing this, is they now accrue 1 hour for every 35 hours worked in the geographic boundaries of the city of Pittsburgh. And we'll talk more about what that means. But as an employee, if I'm working out in Butler or Washington County, this doesn't apply to me unless I do any work in the city of Pittsburgh. So it used to be 1 hour for every 35 hours. It's now 1 hour for every 30 hours. I'm sorry if I misspoke earlier. It's 1 hour for every 35 hours. That favors the employee. They're going to accrue faster. Not a whole lot faster, but faster. The definition of employer size, which has been true since this law was passed or this ordinance was passed, is that they distinguish between large and small employers. A large employer, for purposes of this ordinance, is 15 or more. Not working all in Pittsburgh, just one has to work in Pittsburgh and you're covered. So you could have 10,000 employees and only one is in Pittsburgh, you're covered and considered a large employer. If you're small, so 1 through 14 employees, and one of them works sometime in Pittsburgh, it doesn't have to be full-time, just sometime, you're covered by this law. Whether you're a large or small employer is important only in terms of accrual caps or maximums. So we have a new methodology, 1 for 30, 1 to 30 ratio, and we have new caps or maximums of what people can accrue. You can always be more generous, but this is the floor of what you have to do. So it used to be 40 and 24 is what you had to allow them to accrue as paid sick time. It's now 72 and 48 hours, okay? So depending on whether you're a large or a small employer, and if you're sitting there going, I don't know how I count my employees, we will cover that later. So we have a question already. And this hits directly to the heart. I'm so glad somebody asked this. This is the heart of the issue for a lot of employers. So the question is, what if my company is based in Washington County, clearly outside the city of Pittsburgh, but I have a remote worker in the city of Pittsburgh? So I hope you're sitting down, you are covered. So we'll get into this in more depth. You only have to have one person. So it could be a remote worker. It could be somebody who you say, okay, you know, our business is in Washington County, but we service this one client every Friday morning. And so we send an employee out to the city of Pittsburgh, downtown Pittsburgh. They work 4 hours a morning in this client's building every week or every other week or whatever it is. You're covered. So great question, because it hits at the heart of what a lot of people are concerned about this is, hey, I'm out in Armstrong County. I'm out in Erie County or wherever it is. And I have one employee floating around the city of Pittsburgh. Am I covered? And the answer is always yes. Are there any provisions for temporary? Oh, we're getting a million questions. Okay. All right. Somebody has asked, what if you give PTO and don't define it as sick or vacation? I will cover that later. Are there any provisions for temporary workers? No, there's no exclusions for temporary workers. There are for seasonal workers, and we'll get to that in a second as well. Do we prorate the requirement if the employee is not full-time? So if they're not 2,080 hours or whatever you consider to be full-time, because some employers can, work on less than that, you can use an accrual method and say, all right, hey, Ann's only part-time, which is true for me, and I only hang out in the city of Pittsburgh. We're going to do simple math for yours truly. I only hang out 5 hours a week, and typically that's 20 hours a month. You could say, okay, every 30 hours, I get 1 hour of paid time, right? That's sort of like prorating it. It's the accrual method. You're not front loading it for me. And again, we'll talk more about the front loading versus accrual method and why you might choose one or the other. But these are the issues that we have right at the moment. And I love that we're getting so many questions here. This is just great. My screen is actually exploding. Let me go to the next slide, and I promise I will get to all the questions. But I want to point something out too. So the city of Pittsburgh, and Allegheny County for that matter, have actually pretty good websites that help with compliance. However, the city of Pittsburgh has not updated their websites to reflect this change. They have an announcement about the changes, but they haven't reflected or updated their guidance. And one of the biggest questions out there that I don't have an answer to, and that we have to keep our sort of ear to the ground on, is how does the transition work, right? We'll talk later about this is within a 12-month period that these people accrue, these workers accrue this time. So when we switch from 2025 to 2026, and this becomes the new standard in terms of accrual and hours and caps, how does that work? Is it automatic on the first? If I've worked enough time in the 2025, is it, wow, I just get the extra time? Or do I have to start accruing the extra time in 2026? We don't know the answer to that. I suspect that the answer will be the most favorable answer to the employee, which probably means we ought to be prepared if they have been, particularly if they've been full-time in 2025, to give the extra time. But we don't know that for sure. There will also be a new notice. You're required to post a notice about this. You always have been required. That new notice is not up and running yet on their website. Okay, so we'll have to keep our ear to the ground on all of that. Let me get to a few more questions here. Okay, what about per diem workers? They are not excluded. Seasonal workers are excluded, and seasonal workers have to meet certain definitions to be excluded. You can't just slap the label on everyone and say, hey, they're all seasonal. There's certain hoops you have to jump through, but per diem workers are not excluded. So if you have, and they specifically cover this in some of the guidance, if you have like a daily substitute for a school, that person is covered for whatever hours they work within the city of Pittsburgh. Part-time daily nurses, whatever it might be, anything like that is covered. Okay, how does PTO factor in? We'll cover this more, but PTO can be your vehicle to provide this. If the PTO meets the requirements of this act in terms of the types of conditions it covers, types of reasons it covers for leave, and the type of notice or lack thereof that it requires. So we'll talk more about this, but PTO can absolutely be the way that you give this to people. But oftentimes PTO is not as broad, or vacation time, however you want to, sick time, whatever you want to call it, is not as broad as what this ordinance or the Allegheny County ordinance requires. If you make your PTO as broad as the ordinances require, then it can be the vehicle by which you deliver this paid time off, and you don't have to sort of double the benefit. Okay. Does this drive the minimum you must provide if your current PTO allocation to employees is greater? You can always be more generous, but again, the problem with PTO, vacation, sick, whatever time you want to call, is it doesn't usually, at least historically, cover all the reasons why this can be used, or the notice provisions, which are very flimsy, if I can put it that way, compared to typical PTO. And we'll cover that in more depth as well. And that's been true historically. So that's not really new. That's just a concern within this ordinance that has always been there. The same is true with Allegheny County. Okay, great question again here, because again, this hits to the heart of this ordinance. If you have 4 employees that make deliveries within the city boundaries part-time through the week, do we have to provide the accrual to all 153 employees? No, you only provide it to the employees who actually perform work within the city of Pittsburgh. Now, that can result in some views by other employees that you're not being fair or you're being inequitable. But legally, all you have to do is if you have the 4 drivers, you have to somehow keep track of the amount of time that they work in the city of Pittsburgh and how much paid sick leave that they're earning based on their intermittent deliveries within the city of Pittsburgh. Okay, let me get to one more here and then we'll go back to the slides. Are union associates covered? Yes, except for a very limited, narrow bandwidth of construction workers, but almost everybody else is covered. Wow, you guys are really giving me questions here, and that is great. I'm glad. Let me hit some slides here. Okay, one last question. What we would like to know if summer interns are now potentially covered with the new changes to the act. I believe they are not covered in the past. So interns, first of all, always makes me nervous when people use the term intern. I'm going to assume that they're paid interns. If they are seasonal and you have jumped through the right hoops to make them comply with the definition of seasonal that we'll go over here in a little bit, then no, they're not going to be counted. Whether or not they're seasonal, I don't know, given what's in the question. So, but if you can make them seasonal, they won't be counted. All right, let's flip back to the slides. And again, I love all the questions, so please keep them coming. I just want to make sure we're respectful of everybody's time here because we have a lot of material to cover. So why now? Well, in the announcement, the city of Pittsburgh is sort of poking perhaps at the federal landscape and saying, hey, 40 hours a year or even 72 hours, which is now the higher cap, right? Isn't a lot of paid time off. And we, Pittsburgh, are essentially doing what most of the nation doesn't do. Allegheny County does something similar. And we want our workers to know we care. That's more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but that's more or less what they have said. They have, for a couple of years now, advertised that they have strict enforcement of this law, particularly for what they consider to be vulnerable workers in the food services sector. This law is enforced by the Mayor's Office of Equal Protection. Workers can file a complaint there, and they will investigate and take a look into it. They also do their own, initiate their own investigations. Just based on industries that they think could be a problem, they'll send out letters and say, hey, prove to us that you are compliant. Now, if you're the Washington County employer who asked the question about the one remote worker, that one remote worker is sitting around accruing the time and they must be given it. However, do I think you're a target for the city of Pittsburgh to initiate its own investigation unless your employee complains? Probably not. They're going after the folks, the employers who have a considerable number of workers within the city of Pittsburgh, unless, of course, one of your workers complains, and then, of course, they're going to investigate it. All right, will Allegheny County follow? So when this first happened, when we first got Pittsburgh paid sick days, it took Allegheny County a couple of years to hop on board and say, hey, we're doing the same thing. And their ordinance up to now mirrored almost word for word the city of Pittsburgh's ordinance on paid sick days leave. So if you complied with one, you complied with the other. There were some little differences, but more or less it was the same. That's not true now. So you can have a company in Allegheny County. So CTR is in Allegheny County, right on the border near Cranberry. But we're in Allegheny County. We have to follow the Allegheny County ordinance. But the city of Pittsburgh, if we had remote workers or workers in there, we'd have additional benefits for them. Okay, moving along, and I know I have a lot of questions, but I want to cover at least a few slides here. One of the interesting things, and I think this is really critical to talk about that's new, is, okay, we have the difference now in accrual methodology and the difference in the maximums. Of course, you can always be more generous. As part of the announcement of the changes, the city of Pittsburgh also stated that businesses obviously are required to comply with this. You have to establish and maintain a policy. So even if you have that one remote worker, you have to have a written policy somewhere. You have to post a notice. And this is what is new and different. So in their announcement, they slipped in there. You as an employer must also submit your policy and notice documentation to the email there. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I bumped a button and we'll go back here a second. For their approval. Now, okay, my computer is just doing its own thing for a second here. That is not found anywhere in the text of the ordinance that you are required to submit your policy. And there's pluses and minuses to doing this, right? So it looks like the city of Pittsburgh is headed in the direction that you must submit your policy. Does an announcement pertaining to the changes of this ordinance the equivalent of guidance or regulations or anything like that would require it? Probably not, but there can be some benefit if you want to submit it. I would make sure your policy is very good if you're going to submit it, and that you maybe have had legal counsel review it, because you don't want to lead with your chin and submit a policy that stinks. So after the review of the policies, and they're doing this right now on their website, they will publicly, meaning anybody can look at it, classify you as an employer as safe, meaning you're meeting the bare minimum of this ordinance, thriving, which means you exceed what this ordinance calls for, or non-compliant. In other words, you have a problem and you're probably now being investigated. And everybody and their brother can see that you're a bad employer. Shame, shame on you. You're not complying. So, interesting requirement. I strongly suspect that when they issue the new guidance for how they're going to handle the transition to these new and better benefits, that they're probably going to incorporate this as well, since they put it in their announcement. So if you have that one employee or 100 employees working in the city of Pittsburgh, you need to think about what you might have to submit. Also, if you're ever investigated, obviously the first thing they ask for is your policy and your notices. And for the vulnerable workers in the industries that the city of Pittsburgh deems to be troubling, they sent out to food service industries a year or two ago a letter demanding the policies and notices from all these organizations. And the ones that submitted it are now on the website. So they, interestingly enough, have not stuck anybody in a non-compliant section yet. In fact, that's not built on their website yet. They have thriving workplaces, and you can look at this online should you choose to do so. Of 113 employers within the city of Pittsburgh, 101 are safe, meaning they meet the bare minimum. And there's almost 600 policies pending review. So when you look at this, to give you a flavor of who's on the thriving, safe, etc., it's all the big dogs in town. So the Giant Eagles of the world who have locations in the city of Pittsburgh, Arby's, for instance, is on there. These big chains that, have their own resources, lots of resources that they can turn to say, hey, we have crafted this policy, we submitted it, and we're either in the safe or the thriving category. 7-Eleven is another one that pops up on there. Obviously, there's more employers out there than what's represented by these numbers. So that means not everybody put their hand up and said, hey, let me give you my policy. So that's really something you want to think about. Am I going to give it? What does that look like? Maybe I need to talk to legal counsel. I don't want to turn in a policy that stinks and then have an investigation on my hands as to why I have messed this up. Because if you have submitted a policy that's not good, that's a huge issue, right? You're going to have them looking at who haven't you paid, who didn't you classify right, what hours didn't you keep, because that's all your responsibility. All right, let me get to a couple questions here. And I have to be able to move my cursor. There we go. Sorry, I am a little bit of a technical jinx. A lot of you already know that. Okay, so all right. If a driver is at work driving, is the time they take to simply pass through the city to a delivery code outside the city count? No. So great question, and we'll cover this as well. If the driver is just going from Butler to Washington County and they're just driving through the city of Pittsburgh just by happenstance, that's not considered actual work performed. Even if they stop at the local convenience store and use the restroom and get their lunch and they hang out and eat their lunch, that's not what they're looking for. They're not looking for the pass-through employees who are not performing any work other than sort of just driving through either the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County. They're looking for the driver who's coming into Pittsburgh and, stops at the U.S. Steel building to deliver stuff and then stops at Fifth Avenue Place and delivers stuff and whatever. So just the pass through will not trigger coverage, but you have to make sure it's your burden of proof to show that it's just a pass through and that no actual work is being performed. Okay. Okay, somebody asked, would you be able to specify details on notice regulations related to using PTO to comply with this? Yes, I will get to that. And also get to the reasons you can use this. Okay, if you have one employee working remotely in Pittsburgh, how would they know? I think they mean the city of Pittsburgh know, to put you on the list. So if they require you to submit your policy, they're going to know, right? And right now that quasi requirement is in their announcement of this. So I suspect we're going to see that requirement built into the guidance that's coming out on this. They have promised guidance on this before January 1st. I'd be prepared to say, I may need to submit my policy on this. And of course, if your employee complained, if that employee said, hey, my employer's a real jerk. I'm sitting here, nose to the grindstone, working hard. I'm a remote worker in the city of Pittsburgh, and they don't give me any paid time off, or the paid time off is not as broad as what's covered in this ordinance, and I complain, they're going to investigate you, no matter where you're located, because you have that one employee who's working in the city of Pittsburgh. All right, let me see if I understand this question. We don't currently accrue sick time for employees, but do monitor usage for abuse. If an employee is out for more than 5 consecutive days, it triggers short-term disability. As a large employer in the city of Pittsburgh, do we now need to extend that threshold to 9 consecutive days, 72 hours to comply with new sick leave? So no, you don't need to change your disability policy. You can still keep that at 5 consecutive days they trigger disability. However, you need to make sure that 72 hours is paid somehow. And if part of that is is paid correctly, is paid at the full amount. Sometimes disability is only, 2/3 of the normal pay. If that's the case, you need to supplement that and make sure the full 72 hours is paid at their regular rate. All right, moving along here. We have so many questions. So let me okay, so how does this apply to hybrid workers who work on site in the city, but at home outside of the city? You count the hours that they work in the city towards earning this time. So to make the math simple for me again, 20 hours at home up in Butler County, you can tell I live north, and 20 hours in the city of Pittsburgh, I count the 20 hours in the city of Pittsburgh. I don't count the 20 hours that I'm working in Butler. So that 20 hours that I work in the city of Pittsburgh is what you would base the accrual off of. So in 1.5 weeks, I would accrue 1 hour of paid sick leave under this. All right, and I promise I will stay as long as we need to get through the questions, but we're getting so many. I want to be respectful of everybody's time here and make sure we cover the material. So one of the differences that has always existed between Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh is Allegheny County is triggered at 26 employees. So they've always had a slightly larger or higher threshold for when their paid sick day coverage kicks in. In any event, City of Pittsburgh, you're essentially counting everybody except the owner. If the numbers have varied over the last 12 months, you're looking at the highest number you've ever had. And you count part-timers as one employee. You don't add them up. You don't say, well, hey, Ann works 20 and Joe works 20, so therefore that's one employee. No, Ann's one employee, Joe is one employee. For purposes of counting whether you meet that magic 15 threshold or an Allegheny County 26 threshold. So some examples here that we'll go through. If they have 75 employees, right? Some company has 75 employees, 70 work up in Butler, 5 are in Allegheny County. That company is covered by both the City of Pittsburgh and the Allegheny County laws. So Allegheny County paid sick leave, City of Pittsburgh Paid Sick Days Act, just so you know what those abbreviations are. If the company's headquartered in Washington, it has its only office there. Somebody has basically already asked this question. But because of the pandemic, or for whatever reason, just because they're a nice employer or they need to attract people and allow remote work or whatever the heck the reason is, 2 of the employees live in Allegheny County, but not the City of Pittsburgh, and work presumably as remote workers in Allegheny County, but not the City of Pittsburgh. That company is going to be covered by the Allegheny County sick leave law, but not the City of Pittsburgh. Again, doesn't matter if these employees are part-time or full-time. So if you have a situation where you have 30 part-time employees, all of whom work in Allegheny County or the City of Pittsburgh, and each work for 20 hours a week, each part-time employee is one employee. They're not counted as fractions. That affects how they accrue time, but it doesn't affect whether you're covered by or how large you are under the Pittsburgh Sick Days Act. Okay. ABC Company has 5 employees, 1 in Allegheny County, who's also in the City of Pittsburgh. This employer is going to be covered by the City of Pittsburgh's rules for small employers, which will be a 48-hour max come January, but it's not covered by Allegheny County. It's not large enough. All right, what about this guy? Let's talk about some strategy here. They have the following numbers of employees, and each month, only 5 of them are full-time. The rest are part-time, and you can read the numbers for yourselves. Are they a large or small employer? They're large because they hit 15 in 1 month. So that means for the employees within this group who are working in the City of Pittsburgh, they would get the 72-hour max, not the 48-hour. So think strategically here as an HR person. In my little example, I have 5 of these folks being full-time and the rest are part-time. This employer might have been better off to make someone full-time if they could, rather than hiring a part-time person and putting themselves over 15 in June or at the 15 level in June, and getting the large employer designation. So as an HR person, and I know I have about 20 questions I haven't gotten to yet, you want to think strategically about this. If you're right on the cusp of either that 15 for City of Pittsburgh or 26 number for Allegheny County, if you're concerned about coverage, right, and whether you are going to be a small or large or covered by Allegheny County, think strategically if you're right on that cusp of, am I going to send myself over by hiring a bunch of part-time folks whenever I could hire maybe 1 full-time person? Does that make sense, or does the cost of benefits and whatever outweigh any advantage there? Okay, so owners are not counted. So if they had 25 and 1 owner, they're not going to be covered by Allegheny County's laws, but they would be covered by the Pittsburgh Sick Day Act. Multiple companies are not necessarily aggregated, which is very different than what most laws require. So if you have a bunch of companies and you've got workers in the City of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County, I would certainly recommend legal review of that. But what you're looking at is, how are these companies set up? Are they set up as separate units? or not? And will they be combined? Allegheny County and City of Pittsburgh tend to take the position that they're not typically going to combine the companies. But again, that's really, if you've got a lot of companies, a lot of employees, you really ought to look at that very carefully. All right, you do not count independent contractors or seasonal employees towards those magic numbers, nor are they entitled to the benefits. However, you have to be really, really careful on this. So independent contractors, I cringe to no end when somebody says, I have 5 employees and 15 independent contractors. You probably have misclassified employees that you've misclassified as independent contractors are probably employees. So you got to make sure that they truly are independent contractors. If you've got that screwed up, this is the least of your concerns, frankly, but it is a concern. These people will have been entitled to the paid time. They would have been entitled to benefits, workers' comp, all of the fun employment law protections. You will have a real mess on your hands. So know that the U.S. Department of Labor just announced that it has revised its test once again for independent contractors. It actually loosened up the test a little bit. This keeps happening depending on which administration is in power. And I always say apolitical, but with Republicans, you typically get a less stringent idea or test for who's an independent contractor. And with Democrats, you get a more stringent test because they're trying to protect more workers theoretically. So be aware, though, that you still have to pass a test as to whether or not somebody's an independent contractor, no matter which party's in power. You want to make sure you've got that right. You really should have very few independent contractors running around. Seasonal employees. So they have to work less than 16 weeks. They have to be given written notice at the time that they start that they are a seasonal employee, and note the start and end dates of their employment. If you don't do that, they're not a seasonal employee, even if they're employed less than 16 weeks. Don't forget other labor laws. So as a former labor and employment attorney, please don't ever guarantee employment to anybody. You always want to say they're still an employee at will, because if they stink, we're not keeping them the full 16 weeks. Doesn't matter what that little piece of paper says. But that is something to keep in mind. Somewhat unanswered is the concept of temporary employees. Erring on the side of caution, we're going to count them unless somehow they also count as seasonal workers. But that is a little bit of a gray area under these ordinances. Okay, I know I now have 30 questions. I promise to get to it, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time. Okay, another critical concept here under this ordinance for both Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, geographical boundaries. We're only counting hours that are worked within the city of Pittsburgh. And they have a nice little map and zip codes that you can look at on their site if you have any question as to the geographical boundaries. You also need to consider, if you're large enough to be an FMLA employer, what your 12-month leave year is. So City of Pittsburgh, as well as Allegheny County, allows you to pick the 12-month leave period that we're looking at. It doesn't have to be a calendar year. And so a calendar year is often typical, but not necessarily true for everybody. The best advice for folks who are FMLA employers is you have a rolling look back 12-month period. If you have that as your FMLA leave year, you may want to consider something other than a calendar year for the City of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County ordinances for counting that 12-month window where they can accrue the 48 or 72 hours or whatever number. You have to, in your policies and your notice, define your leave year. So you can't just, when the situation arises, you can't just be like, well, let me think about it now. That should already be in your policy. So a couple examples here, an employee who works out of the Beaver County headquarters 4 days a week, but every Friday she's in the city of Pittsburgh, Allegheny County for 8 hours. Only those 8 hours count towards the accrual of time for either ordinance. and we've talked about this as well, Butler County delivery driver, only the time that he spends in Allegheny County or Pittsburgh making deliveries and driving around town, as long as it's not just a pass-through, are counted. It's okay that it's intermittent contact. It could be like yours truly. Maybe I only work, 10 hours every quarter down in the city of Pittsburgh. That's really intermittent, but it's your obligation to keep track of my hours. And I will accrue at least 1 hour of paid sick time, which isn't much at all, but nonetheless, you owe it to me. So there's no sort of like de minimis amount of time that you can ignore in the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County. All right. Accrual. New employees start accruing on the date of hire, right? But they don't get to use it until they're 90 days in. So look at your probationary periods to see how that lines up with this. You may want to adjust that to match this. It just depends, okay? Also now, the accrual methodology is different. So if you're large enough to be covered by Allegheny County, and a lot of you on here are, you need to look at that and say, hey, I need to prove if I get investigated, I need to be able to prove to Allegheny County, I'm accruing at this rate, into the city of Pittsburgh, I'm accruing at this rate. There's an incentive because I get to carry this over to the next leave year. If I don't use all my time, I get to carry it over. There is some incentive then for me to use all my time. There's no requirement to pay it out. So that ought to be clear in your policy, but there's no requirement under either of these ordinances that you have to pay it out. If you rehire me within 6 months, then I get my accrued amounts reinstated if I haven't already used them. Can always be more generous, right? For exempt employees, those who aren't tracked hourly, they're presumed to work 40 hours a week. So be aware of that. You can front load the time at the start of the 12-month period. That simplifies your record keeping enormously, right? So you can just say, hey, Ann, every leave year, you got 72 hours or whatever it is of paid time. You can do it for certain job categories and not others, as long as you treat everybody within that job category the same. So maybe you say, hey, we turn over our customer service reps all the time. We can't front load it. They'll abuse it. So we're not doing it for them. But for everybody who's in administration, we don't turn them over, right? They're pretty reliable. They stay around. They're not abusing stuff. I'm just making this up. We will front load it for them. So you can have differences in your policies as long as you treat everybody in that same job category the same. You can't say, hey, Ann, we're front loading for you, but not for Joe over there, because then you get into a discrimination issue. Rate of pay is whatever they're typically paid, not counting tips and overtime. If you have unusual pay situations like piece rate or fluctuating pay, you can see the methodology there. Because we're running tight on time, I'm not going to go into it, but essentially you're going to come up with their average and pay that to them for the time they have off. Reasons for use, and here's where we come to the problem with PTO, sick, or vacation, whatever you want to call it. You can read this, and I'm not going to insult you by reading it all to you. It's extremely broad what they can use this time for, right? For their own health concerns, for a relative's health concern, and the term family member, we'll get to it, is defined extremely broadly, or for certain emergencies. So all of that is counted. Now, in a typical PTO policy, or a typical sick or vacation, it might not be this broad. If it's not this broad, the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County will say, hey, it doesn't matter that you're offering 100 hours of PTO time. If it's not this broad, it doesn't count. So if you want to use your PTO, vacation, sick, whatever you've labeled your time as, you need to make sure that it is this broad, or that you put language in there that says it can be used for any of the reasons in these ordinances. Definition of a family member, this is usually the other way that the PTO policies or vacation sick fail, is it's not this broad. Most people don't cover like a grandparent's domestic partner as a reason for taking leave. So if your definition under your PTO policy is broad enough to cover all of these sort of nuances, then your PTO will work for this. If it's not, which a lot of PTO vacation sick policies don't cover everybody under the sun, it's not going to work to count for these ordinances. And I want to point out one critical thing here because a lot of people lose sight of this. Under the FMLA, which doesn't cover everybody on this list either, the FMLA covers anybody who's in loco parenti to somebody. And interestingly enough, that means anybody who's helped raise me as a youngster. The FMLA doesn't restrict the number of parents a child can have. I know that's going to be shocking to a lot of people. A lot of people probably figure, oh, there's 2 biological parents, and maybe there's a step parent or 2 out there, right? Maybe 4 parents total. But the FMLA says no, and these ordinances tend to be broad as well. Anybody, right? So maybe my aunt raised me for every summer. Maybe she's a parent too that I need to take care of. So always be aware of a situation where somebody could say, hey, I need leave under the FMLA or under one of these ordinances for somebody who was in loco parenti to me. In other words, stood as a parent for part of my youth. This is the other reason PTO, so 3 reasons why PTO and vacation type policies fail is they're not broad enough in terms of family members or the reasons for leave, but then they have different notice requirements. So you need a written policy if you want to require leave. You cannot require written notice. So if you have a PTO policy that says, hey, at the beginning of the year, you need to put in the days you went off, or a vacation policy, it's not going to fly under these ordinances because you've required written advance notice. Verbal is sufficient, which means that your first level supervisors need trained. If somebody comes up to them and says, hey, I have a doctor's appointment Friday, being late, that's sufficient. For foreseeable leave, if I have that doctor's appointment on Friday, I can't require more than 7 days in advance, which is also not true. All right, my computer's possessed today. Is also not true for many PTO policies. A lot of PTO policies require more than 7 days advance notice, or vacation policies or whatever. The employee has to make a reasonable effort not to disrupt your schedule, but really that requirement's never enforced, so you might as well forget that. Unforeseeable leave, as soon as practical. So I wake up with the flu. A lot of call-off policies say, hey, Anne, you need at least an hour advance notice to us to call off, or 2 hours, whatever it is. Not this policy. And you can't retaliate or discipline me for using my time here. So I wake up and I just throw on a hat and jeans to get to work. It takes me all of 2 minutes. A lot of you are probably saying I can tell. You can't, and when I wake up 10 minutes before I'm supposed to start my shift, and I decide I have the flu, and I call you 10 minutes before I'm supposed to start my shift and say, sorry, I won't be there. There's nothing you can do about it. That was an unforeseeable leave. I didn't know I was going to wake up with a flu. I get to use the paid time. You can't discipline or retaliate against me, even though I messed up your entire schedule for that day. Increments, this is also important, and this is also why PTO policies fail. Oftentimes PTO has to be used in like half-day increments. Not so with this. This says basically in an hour or the smallest amount of time your payroll system can track for other types of leaves. So for FMLA, it's often common to use a 15-minute window for FMLA because there's regulations out there that promote that. If you're tracking FMLA in 15-minute increments, you need to do that for these ordinances as well. And if your PTO policy says, hey, half day only, your PTO policy is now not going to work for these ordinances, even if it's more generous than what these ordinances require. So this is why the PTO vacation sick policies of the world fail. It's because they're violating one of these issues. And the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County is going to say, hey, we're not going to count your PTO towards the paid sick leave because it doesn't meet one of these requirements. And now you have a real catch-22 because maybe you've been generous with your PTO policy and you give employees 3 weeks off, And city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County is saying, well, tough luck. You still have to give them another 48, 72 hours, whatever it is, because you restricted how the PTO could be used or what it could be used for, the increments it could be used in. The only time you can request documentation is if the absence is more than 3 consecutive working days. Just to give a quick example of that, because I know we're very close on time. And again, I promise to stay as long as we need for the questions. You can only require a generic notice. So if I've been out more than 3 consecutive working days, which could mean I'm scheduled Friday, I'm off Friday, Saturday and Sunday don't count because I'm not scheduled. Monday, Tuesday, I'm out. Now I've got 3 consecutive working days, assuming I was scheduled for Monday and Tuesday. And I bring in a notice from the nurse practitioner or the chiropractor or doctor or whoever who's a healthcare professional that says, hey, Ann needed the time off. Doesn't say why, doesn't say whether I'm going to need more time, doesn't say, hey, Ann was in the hospital or anything like that. It's sufficient. You can't request clarification. There's no system to challenge it. I've kind of just done everything that I needed to do. Very vague. That does not, however, if this leave is also triggering FMLA leave, and remember, it might not always because this is broader than FMLA, doesn't affect what you can request on the medical certification for FMLA or your right to clarification or second or third opinions for FMLA. But for the paid time off, I'm golden as long as I have given you that after 3 consecutive workdays. I can certainly have a situation, possibly I'm gaming the system, possibly I'm not, where every Monday I call off. It's tough after Steelers games. I just can't get up. But it's not 3 consecutive working days. I don't owe you any type of documentation at all, and you can't require it. I wasn't available. I was sick. Okay. We've kind of already talked about this. If you have a collective bargaining agreement that spells out PTO and you want to try to double dip there to cover these, you're going to have to talk to Labor Council, because that would mean opening up your collective bargaining agreement for the union folks, and that may be a can of worms. So, in fact, I'm sure it will be. All right, FMLA is a different story. It's not as broad. We've kind of covered all this already. Always on those certifications, let me just highlight here. Don't, on the FMLA medical certification, you don't have to accept unknown duration or the length of the condition is unknown. Those medical providers are being paid to provide an educated estimate. Obviously, things can change, right? Happens to all of us. But be careful with those medical certifications, particularly if you think you have somebody who's gaming the system or isn't reliable or something else. Look at that carefully. The FMLA certifications are a completely different ball of wax. They may get benefits under these ordinances for Pittsburgh or Allegheny County and not be entitled to FMLA, or vice versa. Enforcement retaliation. Again, it's always the employer's burden of proof to show the time worked in these locations and the amount of time that the person has used. Both of this county and the city have said that if you can't come up with these timekeeping records, they're going to assume that you're guilty, basically, that you violated these 2 ordinances. You don't want that type of assumption meted out towards you. So it's your burden of proof. Prohibitions, of course, failure to respond or cooperate to an investigation also is a presumption of noncompliance. So if you get a letter, don't put it in the circular file, aka the trash bin. You need to respond, get counsel probably. Prohibition on retaliation, watch the emails, watch the first level supervisor who's now really ticked off that Ann called off with only 10 minutes notice and didn't show up for a shift. Consider whether your EPLI, that's your insurance for employment practices, provides any coverage for this. That's a question worth asking. Any adverse action under the Pittsburgh Sick Days Act, and this is really a tough pill for employers to swallow, is considered or presumed to be retaliatory. In other words, you have an uphill battle to prove that, Ann gave us only 10 minutes notice when she called off on July 1st. On August 1st, we fired her because she's a lousy employee. She just can't cook those fries right. She keeps burning them. Even though your reason for terminating me on August 1st was because of my failure in the culinary arts at the French fry fryer, there's going to be a presumption that it was retaliatory under the Pittsburgh Sick Days Act. And that's a concern. I don't necessarily think that's fair for employers, but you need to know that's out there. All right, real life, and then we'll get to all the questions because I'm over 40 at this point. Emily, our employee, works in the city of Pittsburgh full time. She's been there for 5 years. She's a good employee, no issues. The employer has 30 full-time employees and 25 part-time employees. She works Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. She tells her manager and close friend, that's always the problem with the first level supervisors, they tend to be friendly, that she's suffering from back problems from lifting boxes at work and her back's killing her. She's seeing a chiropractor next Monday. We can't solve this whole issue right now, but what are the issues that we have to look at here? As an HR person, you're making your list. 1, workers' comp, right? She is attributing her back problem to lifting boxes at work. That's our first issue. Are we an FMLA employer? You bet we are. Those part-time employees count as 1 each. And so we're out over the magic 50 number for FMLA. Workers' comp and FMLA should be run concurrently. So we need to be looking at that. Do we have a city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County sick leave issue? You bet. Did she give us enough notice? You bet she did. It was verbal. She doesn't have to do anything else. She told her supervisor, that's the same as telling the president of the company, he's this person, he or she is a supervisor. It's notice to us. It was verbal. She was kind enough to give advance notice. So she certainly has met any notice requirement. Can we get a doctor's note? No, it's 1 day. If it turns into more, maybe it's more. Do we offer her FMLA paperwork? Do we have her fill out workers' comp forms? Probably on all that. Depends on exactly how that doctor's visit plays out. But certainly the workers' comp, if we have panel docs, we may be sending her to a panel doc first. We need to look at that very carefully. So can't solve all the problems for Emily here, but as an HR representative, we certainly should be looking at all of those issues as this is our company. It's layered like an onion, and we have to make sure we hit all or check all the boxes because there's multiple leave type issues surrounded here. It's not just Pittsburgh, it's not just Allegheny County, it's the FMLA, it's workers' comp. It might be the ADA as well, depending on whether this back problem turns into a disability that needs accommodated in our workforce. So all of those are important to look at. All right, thank you all for attending. I'm going to hit all the questions now. Feel free to stay or go as your schedule demands, of course, but we're going to cover all the questions. If you still have questions, feel free to add them as I am going through these other questions, and we're going to roll up here. Okay. We're going to get to the union question last because that's quite involved. Are 5 days of paid sick time guaranteed in the city of Pittsburgh part of PTO or separate? So again, depends if your PTO policy is broad enough in all of the categories that we just talked about and compliant enough with respect to notice or lack thereof, as well as the time increments that can be used. So PTO can definitely be the solution to this if it's broad enough and worked correctly. But the problem is most PTO policies aren't. Does this only apply to companies' employees within the city limits? We have a Pittsburgh address, but don't fall within the city limits. So it's only within the city limits, but it includes any workers working within the city limits. It doesn't matter where your business is located. You could be located in Idaho and have one remote worker in the city of Pittsburgh geographical limits. So on the city of Pittsburgh website, it gives the zip codes and sort of like a map of the geographical boundaries. You probably want to double check that to make sure the city of Pittsburgh agrees that you're not within their geographical boundaries. Okay. How does this apply for hybrid workers who work on site in the city, but at home outside the city? Again, you're counting the hours that work in the geographical limits of the city of Pittsburgh, not the hours at their house that's outside of Pittsburgh. Are hours carried over from year to year? Yes, up to the caps. So 48 and 72 would be carried over if they haven't used it. Again, there's an incentive for employees to use the time because then they get to accrue it again. Unless, of course, they're expecting a baby or something like that, that they know they have surgery coming up and they need to do it at the beginning of the year and whatever, they may want to carry it over. Okay, is there any difference on who's covered between hourly, non-exempt versus salaried exempt? No, not at all. We had to change some employees from exempt to non-exempt due to the recent FLSA guidance and overtime laws, and each type of employee receives different benefits. That's fine. Our exempt employees receive sick time while our non-exempt employees receive profit sharing, but no sick time. Because we define sick time for our exempt employees, do we have to provide the covered sick time allotment to our non-exempt employees as well, or can PTO still be the driver that covers this? So again, PTO can be the driver that covers this for any and all employees, so long as you've set it up correctly, which again, most PTO is not set up correctly because it requires things like half-day increments. It won't allow you to use it in an hour or 15 minutes or whatever the smallest increment is that you're using for other leave laws. Okay. So, but the basic question, is there a difference between exempt and non-exempt here? Doesn't matter. All employees are covered, except perhaps seasonal, if you've handled that correctly. We are a union general contractor with jobs in the city of Pittsburgh. I feel like I know the answer, just making sure. The union employees are covered by this new law, as well as any of the office employees who are working on the job sites. Our office is outside the city of Pittsburgh. Yes, that's true. There is a very narrow bandwidth exception for construction workers, if you want to look at that under the law, under the ordinances. But virtually every union member is covered with this really narrow exception. And the office employees would be as well, to the extent that they're working in the city of Pittsburgh at the job sites. Our temporary employees, employees on leave of absence, or seasonal employees that included in the count of total employees to determine a large or small employer. So great question. Seasonal employees, if you treated them correctly, are not necessarily counted. The other two categories are not well explained in the ordinance. So temporary employees, I'd want to know a lot more about that relationship to know whether or not to count them. How much control do you have over them? My guess is you're probably counting them. Employees on a leave of absence. So that is not squarely addressed within these ordinances. However, if we look at the FMLA to get some guidance, we do count employees on a leave of absence to know whether or not you're over that magic 50 number for the FMLA. So the FMLA says any employee on a leave of absence who's expected to return, right? You have a reasonable expectation that they'll return. Anne's just out on maternity leave, or Anne's just out because she's klutzy and she broke her leg. You expect me to return in 6 to 12 weeks. You count me as an employee. And again, we're counting the highest number during the prior year to know whether or not I'm covered. Okay, let's see here. You keep mentioning 72 hours max for 6 times. Do you really mean it's a minimum cap that is required for a large company? Okay, let me try, if I haven't stated that well, let me try to, under the ordinance, you're not required to give more than 72 hours if you're a large company. You can always be more generous. Some companies thrive on having a culture that is more generous, and you want to give 300 hours of paid sick time. They're going to put you in the thriving category when they review your policy. You definitely can do that. The 72 hours under this law is the maximum an employee can accrue under this law. You can always be more generous and give them more time. I hope that unconfuses anything I might have said. Okay, somebody's asking about is there a minimum number of hours employees have to work? We have employees that work under 20 hours and are not currently eligible for PTO for our policy. This is another reason PTO policies fail. No, there's no minimum number of hours I have to work. I just have to work 30 within the city of Pittsburgh to accrue 1 hour. It may take me 6 months to work 30 hours because I'm so intermittent as an employee. But it's your job, your burden of proof to count the number of hours, and your burden of proof to give me that 1 hour off if I ask for it after I hit 30 hours. So just because I'm under 20 hours typically a week Doesn't affect my eligibility here. It just affects how quickly I accrue time. Okay, we use H-2B workers. That's an immigration type visa. For those of you who don't know, they only work for the season, April to September. I'm guessing we might have an agricultural situation here. It is more than 16 weeks, but they are only seasonal. Based on the federal immigration petition that they filed. Do we need to cover them? Yes. So state law, local law can always be more generous than federal law. And the federal definition of who's seasonal for the H-2B visa petitions is totally different than this. They're totally unrelated. So they're working more than 16 weeks, they're covered. Now, the reality might be that they're never going to get to use this time because remember, they don't get to use it for the first 90 days of employment. So we've knocked out approximately 12 weeks there. The last 4 weeks of their employment, or it's a little bit more than 4 weeks, they may get to use the time because then they'll be past that 90-day period where they can't use the time when they're first hired. But they're not seasonal because you haven't given them the right notices and it's more than 16 weeks. So seasonal for federal law, not for this. I was late to the call, so I may have missed it. That's okay. I frequently miss things even if I'm on time. Will we receive a copy of the slide deck? Yes. So again, to reiterate, this whole webinar, if you have insomnia, it has been recorded for you. You can re-listen to this, as well as the slide deck. I'm not in charge of that. I'm a technical jinx. Lots of people have heard me say that multiple times. Other folks here take care of it. Give them a little bit of time because they have to format and work some magic that I don't understand. It goes out to everybody along with the SHRM code if you're interested in SHRM credit for attending this webinar. So all that will be provided to you. Just give us a little bit of time. Okay, what happens if we pay a doctor a daily rate of a certain amount and they work in the city 4 days a week, 30 hours a week? How many hours would we have to pay her a year at what rate? Okay, so there's a lot built into this. First of all, that doctor is going to accrue 1 hour in this example, assuming they're not working more than 30 hours, because it's your obligation to keep track of that. And knowing professionals, oftentimes you say 30 hours, but gosh, that pediatric patient shows up at 5 o'clock just as they're closing, and the doctor's compassionate, and she takes that pediatric patient who turns out to be a basket case, and now she's worked 35 hours because she had to get that person admitted to the hospital and whatever. So first, your obligation to keep track that it truly is 30 hours and not more in a week. All right. Number 2, she's earning at least 1 hour of paid time off for that week. She may or may not use it, or he, whatever the doctor is. That's up to that person whether they're going to use it, but they certainly have the right to use it if they want to. So 6 months into this, I don't know what that is. They've got several hours accrued. I'm not good at math. And they wake up with the flu, right? They're going to have, let's say they have accrued the whole day at that point, just to make math easy for me. They've accrued a whole day's worth of pay. Their regular rate is the daily rate that you provided here. I don't really want to shout it to everybody. That's what you would pay them, is the daily rate. If they missed, let's just say 1 hour, and their normal workday is 8 hours, we would take the amount you provided, divided by 8. We'd come up with some number that's a little, you can do the math. And that's what we would pay them for that hour. But they're certainly entitled to this benefit. And we would work out the pay rate based on how many hours they normally work or what that expectation is, divided by the total per diem rate, and pay them for that. Okay, any word out there about whether Allegheny County will update their requirements to align with the City of Pittsburgh? I bet they will. But they're kind of slow. So they didn't issue their own sick leave policy for several years after the City of Pittsburgh had theirs going. So I think eventually they'll probably get around to it, but I don't think it's going to be by January 1st. Okay. If you front load the time, do you have to let them carry over any time? And if so, how much? So front loading presumes, let's just say every year you give them 50 hours, or let's make it more. You give them 80 hours every calendar year. They're not carrying over time then because you've just front loaded 80 hours. That's more than enough to cover that new year. So no, assuming that you have front loaded a sufficient amount to cover the number of hours that might be out there, whether it's 48 or 72, they're not carrying over more because the next year they get a new batch of hours that meets or exceeds the amount of time they would be owed. Okay, how does this apply to already established collective bargaining agreements? It's a problem. So it depends. You're required to do this regardless of what's in your collective bargaining agreement, with the narrow band exception of certain construction workers. But assuming that's not you, you have to do this. Doesn't matter that your collective bargaining agreement might not be as generous or might give more time, but not for the reasons outlined in these ordinances. If you want to open up your CBA so that you can use that time that might already be built in for these ordinances, you need to get labor counsel, because when you open up a CBA or you try to do a memorandum of understanding or whatever vehicle you want to use to try to alter the CBA, you may get requests to renegotiate other things too, and that can be a problem. So you definitely want to get labor counsel involved there. But your requirements under here are not affected by your CBA. If the CBA is already broad enough to cover this, great, you win. If it's not, you need to be looking at revising that CBA with the help, hopefully, of labor counsel. Okay. Our PTO policy doesn't require any reason. An employee can take it for any reason at any time. It also allows for more than is required under the ordinances. Are we good with this, or should we include these reasons in the written policy? So I would also make sure that the written notice and the increments that this time can be used are consistent between your PTO policy and the ordinances. Remember, a lot of PTO policies require that it be used in half-day increments, which is not true of these ordinances. So if you check those things, then great. Maybe your PTO is going to work for this. Would I put a mention of it in the policy? I don't think you need to list everything under the sun, but you can certainly put a line in there, and I think it's worth doing, of saying this PTO is meant to comply with the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County sick day leave ordinances and can be used for any of those reasons and meet the requirements of time and notice under those ordinances as well. That wasn't very eloquent what I just said, but language to that effect, that this is meant to comply with those laws for the reasons, timing, notice, etc., under those laws. Okay. Okay, how do you handle this leave for employees that have unlimited PTO? So I worked at a firm that had unlimited PTO for partners and most attorneys. And that is fine. That's a very, very generous benefit. Most of the time it's not abused because it is so generous. Every now and then it does get abused. But here is the trick again. Can I use it for any reason listed under the ordinances in any amount of time listed under the ordinances without any notice or very little notice? You've got to make sure you check all those boxes or it won't matter. This time won't count. And that's a really bitter pill to swallow when you have such a generous unlimited PTO policy. So just make sure you're checking all those boxes for your PTO to work. Okay, if my current sick time off policy is 1 hour increments, and we also track FMLA in 1 hour increments, because your HR information system uses whole hours only, is keeping 1 hour increments sufficient under a new ordinance? Yes, that's the default methodology, is 1 hour increments, unless you keep time in shorter increments for any other type of leave, and you're not. You're not keeping FMLA in 15-minute leave or something like that. So you would be okay. 1 hour, you can't force it for more than 1 hour, regardless of how you track other leave. Okay, what is the smallest increment of time off that iSolve can track? I think it's pretty small, but I am not the technical guru. I'm going to ask that you refer that to your iSolve CTR rep here, because I don't want to give the wrong answer, and they don't let me touch technology. Okay, sorry, I can't provide a better answer for that. Okay, exempt employees are generally given the option to use vacation, personal, or sick time in half-day or whole-day increments. Very standard. Does this require providing sick time in hourly increments? And if so, does that potentially treat exempt employees in a way that would question their exemption status? Great, great, great question. Thank you. I wish I knew who this was. It's an anonymous attendee, whoever you are. Fantastic question. So yes, hourly is the default unit of time under both of these ordinances. So you can't force me to use this time in increments larger than an hour. So if I call up and say, my kid is sick, I'm getting alternate coverage, she can't go to daycare. And I call over my mom and I show up an hour later. I'm an hour late to work, but I'm here. You can't force me to use a half day of PTO. If you do, that PTO is not going to count towards the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County ordinances. That defeats the purpose. You don't want to have to give me more time than you're probably already giving to me. So an hour is the default increment. This does not change whether they're exempt or non-exempt. You have to keep track of my time. If I'm exempt and I work now and then in the city of Pittsburgh, you have to know what hours I'm working. The fact that you have to know what hours I'm working or that you're paying this in 1 hour increments does not change my exempt status. That has nothing to do with it. I understand the concern that typically we're only tracking hours for non-exempt workers, but this law requires it, these laws, these ordinances. That's not going to change my exempt status, assuming I meet the federal tests for being exempt in terms of duties and pay. So that should not be a concern there. Are you calling off or just talking to your friend? Was the conversation off the clock or on? So I'm not sure I understand this question. If this was in regards to my example with Emily, the employee, it doesn't matter whether I'm sitting there with Emily and the supervisor is sitting there with Emily having lunch off the clock, and I say my back is killing me, that knowledge has still been passed on to the supervisor, even if it was off the clock. You got to be really careful with first level supervisors because they often tend to be friendly with their subordinates. But what they learn is the same as Emily sitting there with the president of the company saying, hey, my back is killing me because I've been lifting boxes, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to the chiropractor on Monday. So it doesn't matter whether the conversation's off the clock or on. There's no such thing as just talking to your supervisor as a friend. Supervisors have to understand that. The knowledge they gain, they need to make it clear. If somebody says to them, hey, off the record, their first step should be to that employee, I can't guarantee it will be off the record, right? I have a duty to this company to report anything that would be related to the company. Now, if the off the record conversation is, do I look fat in this dress? No, we don't need to report that to the company, right? That can be a friend conversation. But if the conversation is, my back is killing me, or I want you to know I, have an alcoholism problem or who knows what, that gets told, they have an affirmative duty and they should set the expectation with their employee before they get into a conversation like that, that conversation may not be confidential. All right. Okay, yeah, so the construction worker exceptions are in Allegheny County and the city of Pittsburgh. It's very limited. I'm going to refer you to their websites to look at that because it is so limited. It's a very narrow sub bandwidth there. Let's see here. We are based in Pittsburgh, but only require staff to come into the office once a month. However, we have a remote worker who lives in Pittsburgh and works from home. How does this apply to her? Does that mean every day counts towards the sick leave count? Yeah, for her it does, because she's working remote in the city of Pittsburgh. So assuming she works 40 hours a week, she's accruing 1 point something hours of paid sick leave each week. For all the employees who come into the office once a month, let's say they come in for an 8-hour day, just to give some meat to the bones here. Each of them is accruing 1 hour every 30 hours. So in a little over a month, right, in about 5 weeks time, less than that actually, 4 times 8, in 1 month's time, they will have accrued 1 hour. So they'll never reach the caps in this example, but they will have some time that's available to them as paid sick time. Okay, if we front load, can we say there's no carryover? Yes, assuming you're front loading a sufficient amount of time every 12 months. Okay, the excluded construction worker list, again, if you look at the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County websites, it's on there. You can look at what they say about who isn't covered. Just to clarify, as far as increments, we should allow PTO to be used in as little as 15-minute increments in order to be compliant with the FMLA. And is this PTO ordinance? So yeah, FMLA talks about using FMLA in the shortest amount of time that your timekeeping system is capable of keeping track of. Some timekeeping systems can keep track of it to the minute. Now, that's probably not realistic for anybody's FMLA policy to start keeping FMLA in terms of minutes. But if you have an electronic payroll timekeeping system, you want to look at that. Certainly not more than an hour. A lot of companies use 15 minutes. You need to weigh convenience and your timekeeping system's capabilities versus your concern under the law of what does it mean to keep time in as short an increment as possible under FMLA. And that's a hard one. And it often depends on which administration is in power as to how strict they're going to be on that. Certainly no more than an hour. The default under these ordinances, which is what I think you're referring to in the PTO, is an hour. If, however, you opt to make FMLA tracked in 15 minutes, then you would track these in 15 minutes because that's the shortest amount of time you're using for other leaves like the FMLA. Okay, sorry if this was already shared. Will the recording be sent later? Yes, somebody else does that, not me. A technical jinx, but that will be made available to everybody. Let's see here. Do excluded construction workers count towards the number of employees needed to fall under either Allegheny County or Pittsburgh sick leave rules? I actually don't know the answer to that, and I'm sorry. I think that they don't, but I'd want to double check that. So you may want to look at those websites and double check that. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. Can time be used immediately as it's accrued, or can you have a waiting period until the employee can use it? So new hires, there's a 90-day waiting period that you can implement. You don't have to, but you can implement. After that 90-day period, I can use it whenever I want, assuming I've accrued it. Does paid sick time carry over? Yes, if you're using the accrual method, it carries over from 12-month period to 12-month period up to the caps. Thoughts on substituting for unlimited PTO? So I'm not sure I understand that question. If you have unlimited PTO, nobody's going to appreciate it if you reduce it to these caps. I would look at that differently through a different lens and say, can I make sure my PTO policy is compliant with all the reasons and increments and notice requirements of these ordinances? And do I have any FMLA overlap here that I want to make sure gels well in terms of leave years or anything like that? Okay, do you count hours over 40 for exempt salary workers? Yes. So the assumption is they work 40 hours a week. If, however, you know for sure they're working and it's your obligation to keep track of this, like that doctor, right? We talked about working down in the city of Pittsburgh who takes that pediatric patient at the last minute. Then it's your obligation to know that, keep track of it, and they would earn it. Oftentimes, exempt employees are getting more than enough PTO. If you set the PTO up correctly, you'll be okay, but you got to make sure it's set up correctly. We have remote employees who answer calls for Pittsburgh clients, and our office is located in the city of Pittsburgh. If they live outside, let's say Butler, would they be covered, or is it where they're working from? It's where they're working from. So if I'm working, you may be a city of Pittsburgh employer, but I, as the employee, am working in Butler, and I work there all the time. I never leave my home, even though I'm taking calls from folks who might be in the city of Pittsburgh, and you, as the employer, are located there. I don't get the benefit. Now, there may be equitable issues there. You may get unhappy employees that this customer service rep who's out in Butler doesn't get it, but the customer service reps who are in the city of Pittsburgh at your headquarters do get it. So you may want to look at that in terms of equity and a few things like that, but you're not required to. All right, I think I'm getting towards the end here. Is this boots on the ground accrual? If you mean, yeah, they have to be within the city of Pittsburgh limits physically, right? To accrue. If you do not carry over the hours at the end of the year, can you have a use it or lose it policy, or do you need to pay it out? So you don't have to pay it out, but you are required to carry over the hours. You can't have a use it or lose it policy. If the PTO exceeds the caps, they can lose the amount that exceeds the caps, but they can't lose the amount up to the caps. That will carry over. Okay, so if the payroll system, such as iSolve for CTR, can track in less increments than 1 hour, are we required to offer the smallest amount that iSolve CTR can track? No, you're required to offer the smallest amount that you offer leave of any other type in. It doesn't matter that your payroll system can actually keep it down to the minute or the second. You say, hey, what do I offer other leave time in? It can't be more than an hour, but if I'm not offering any other leave time shorter than an hour, I don't have to do it down to the minute, even though my payroll system could do it down to the minute. Okay, if an employee is no call, no show for the shift, this is grounds for termination within our company. Would this change because of this PTO ordinance? So the answer to that in true legal fashion is maybe. So I'm required in unforeseeable circumstances as an employee to give you notice as soon as practical. A lot of times the person's just never going to contact you again, right? They're a bad employee. But let's say I woke up with the flu and my husband took me to the ER because I was having troubles breathing. And they admitted me, and by the time I got put on oxygen and whatever, the whole day was gone. And I never called you, and I never showed up for work. And you reach out to me and say, hey, you were no call, no show. We're terminating you. And I say, wait, don't terminate me. I have a reason. And I tell you what happened. I have now provided you with reasonable notice given what happened to me. So you'd probably have to reverse that decision. This is going to be a case-by-case basis, obviously, right? But if I tell you something and the notice has been reasonable, given the tragic circumstances that I had that landed me in the ICU, then that decision is not going to stand under this law to terminate me. And remember that under the Pittsburgh Sick Days Act, they presume that any adverse employment action within like 90 days is retaliatory. That's the presumption you'd be up against defending. Okay. We have employees submit a form to signal to payroll that they want to use paid time to cover their leave. If the employee fails to submit a form by the time the pay period runs, would the employer ever be required to honor the paid time the employee failed to submit? Possibly. This is another sort of factual question here. So, I think I would ask the question to some of these workers or their supervisors of what they know. Sometimes the supervisors know why that person was out. You can't require written notice from these employees to use this time. And so I think you have a heavy burden on your shoulders to have some information, some knowledge as to why this person was out. And if they were out for a reason that's covered under this, they don't have to submit an additional written notice to get paid. It's just sort of your automatic obligation. So again, a little bit of a fact-intensive inquiry, but I'd be very, very careful of that and not paying them just because they didn't submit some type of written notice. If you had other notice to the first level supervisor that Ann was out because she went to the doctors, that notice is the same as Ann telling the president of the company. That first level supervisor needs trained to know to say, hey, guess what? Ann triggered the paid sick days or whatever it is. All right. If they don't reach the cap, they only work 8 hours in Pittsburgh, what are the requirements for carryover? They carry over whatever they've accrued up to the cap. So if I've only earned 8 hours in my 12-month period, I carry over the 8 hours. I don't carry over the full cap. I carry over that amount, which I've accrued up to the cap. All right, we recently had an employee submit workers' comp documentation. The workers' comp was denied. Workers' comp instructed us not to pay sick time until the investigation was completed. Now that the investigation has been completed, should we pay out the paid sick time? Note, we have requested the employee to fill out the sick time form, but they have not yet done so. So again, they're not required to fill out any written form for this. If the absence was more than 3 consecutive working days, you might be entitled to some sort of note. I bet you already have enough information through your workers' comp carrier that would qualify it as a note. I'm very concerned that your workers' comp carrier said don't pay out the paid sick time. I'd have a long discussion with them. They may not be thinking about the local laws here. This may be a national carrier who's just not thinking about this, some adjuster who's doesn't even know this exists. I would really have a discussion with them about that because I think that is concerning. So yeah, be careful of that. Okay. We have full-time banquet serving employees that make $23.65 an hour. We will continue to pay full-time staff that rate for sick pay. However, is it okay to pay our on-call staff the minimum wage of $7.25 when they call out sick? So under this law, you pay them their normal hourly rate, whatever that is. You can't reduce it. So be careful of that. You don't have to include tips or overtime, but if they were scheduled to work and their normal hourly rate was $23.65, not including tips or overtime, you can't reduce it to $7.25 an hour under these ordinances. Somebody said, thank you so much. Of course, you're welcome. I like doing these educational things. It says, it sounds like you can define your own notice requirements, but really if no notice is given, it's going to be in favor of the employee. Would that be correct? That's correct. And you can define your own notice up to a certain extent. You can't require written notice, and you can't require more than 7 days advance notice for foreseeable conditions. And for unforeseeable conditions, I wake up sick, it just has to be reasonable, whatever that may be, which will, I guarantee you, be interpreted in favor of the employee. So yes, you're on the right path there. It's not clear in the guidelines what construction unions are exempt. Do you have a link that will list this? No, I do not have a link. There are some Q&As on the city of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County websites that might help more that talk about the construction workers, but I do not have any additional link. I'm sorry, there's not always great clarity in the law. Can you confirm that the carryover up to the 72-hour cap is only for what the employee accrued for the calendar year? It's not necessarily the calendar year, it's whatever 12-month period you set. So be careful of that. You should be controlling the leave year. But yes, they only carry over up to the cap for that prior leave year, that prior 12-month period. All right, I think I have one more question, and everybody who's saying thank you, you are quite welcome. I think I skipped a union question up here. Let me just see if I can find it real quick. Okay, somebody else has asked a question. Currently, our PTO policy starts at 80 hours accrued weekly for the calendar year. With these changes, would that keep us in compliance, or will we need to make changes to the policy to start tracking hours worked in the city? Okay, so again, it might work if it's for the reasons available in the increments available with the notice or lack thereof requirements as well. So you can always use PTO for this, but you have to make sure the PTO is structured correctly. All right, let's see. I am not seeing this question. Okay. Okay, here's the question. We are a union house. In the CBA, so the collective bargaining agreement, we have a clause that states employees who are absent due to sickness and who have exhausted authorized sick pay shall be required to use eligible vacation days for such absences. Once eligible vacation and sick time has been exhausted, employees will be subject to progressive discipline for each day of the absence from work, provided, however, that no discipline will be issued for any day of absence for which the employee presents a certificate within 4 calendar days from a physician duly licensed to practice medicine in the United States. With that said, I believe we can still follow this clause as long as the current 5 days of sick have been used in the 9 days come 2026. So again, this is a situation where it does that CBA. You might have enough time under it currently because the 5 days right now it's 40 hours, right? That will change obviously in 2026. So you might have enough time right now under the CBA. But the question again is that CBA structured to cover the breadth of issues that could be, that could come up? Who's the family member, types of conditions I can leave for, emergencies I can leave for, whatever it is, in the increments I can use for, and the notice provisions as well. I bet it might be lacking in some of those. If that's the case, then it's not going to work for you, and you need to consider hopefully with Labor Council, saying, gosh, can we revise this, which will actually benefit the workers? That's how you sell it, is this is actually going to benefit the union members, because this city of Pittsburgh Allegheny County is more generous. It allows for more reasons of leave. It allows in smaller increments, less notice, whatever. We need to have a memorandum of understanding, or we need to open up the CBA and revise that clause, whatever it might be. Again, when you get into doing that, you open up other things for negotiation. So it's good to have Labor Council quarterbacking that to try to help you. But so I hope that helps. Let me just scroll down, make sure I don't have any more questions. Okay. What about per diem workers such as day-to-day subs who can choose their assignments? It doesn't matter. If they choose an assignment in the city of Pittsburgh, those hours count in terms of what you're paying out or accruing. Someone says, still confused. I'm sorry. This is confusing stuff, but I'm trying. Still confused on how we know to pay the employee time off if they aren't submitting backdating a request to use paid time. Our employee clocks in and out. We don't require advance notice, but how would we track without some kind of form? I understand and empathize with your concern, especially if you have a lot of employees. The law does not empathize with your concern. And that is unfortunate. I totally understand. You're saying, well, how do I know that Ann has the flu? She didn't tell anyone. I have no idea. First of all, your policy should be telling me to tell someone, but you can't have me necessarily put it in writing, because that is not permissible under this, right? I only have to give verbal notice. You should also train your first level supervisors that if I mentioned to Susie Q supervisor that I had the flu, she would know to initiate something. I definitely empathize with that concern. It's just that the law doesn't empathize. And that happens a lot of times, right? The law doesn't think about all the nuances and the practicalities of what employers face. They just say you have to do X, Y, Z, and they don't care that it's a problem. And that's really, I think, the frustration that you're verbalizing here is that's really tough for me to know, especially if I have a lot of employees, if I don't have them signing forms and submitting forms and stuff. Do I think that could work into your defense if somebody said, well, hey, they never paid me and they never told anybody? Yeah, I think that could be helpful to a defense of one of these claims, but it's not going to exonerate you. And oftentimes the first level supervisor knew something, and that's going to be a problem for you. So I definitely empathize with you, but the law unfortunately does not. Okay, would the notice requirements mean that we can no longer include 2 hours before start time as part of our policy or attendance improvement plans? If we're talking about these first 48, 8, or 72 hours, and somebody calls off later than that, that's not part of a performance improvement plan. That's excused, as long as it was reasonable notice for an unforeseen type of issue. You can't discipline, you can't put that in a PIP, whatever. If I go beyond that 48 or 72 hours and I'm still doing this, then of course it's part of the PIP or discipline or whatever it is. It's just for that paid time off that you can't do it. And I can certainly game the system if I'm an employee, right? I have migraines. I keep waking up with them. And so I miss the first hour or two of work every day without the 2-hour notice ahead of time. And that could go on for quite some time because I'm a full-time employee and I've accrued 72 hours. That's a real problem for you guys. And it's a pain in the you-know-what that I can't say on a recorded video. But you're stuck, right? This, again, is a situation where the law does not empathize with the practical realities or the fact that somebody could game the system. It's just, you're kind of stuck. That if you can certainly have that as you request the notice of 2 hours. But if they don't do it, they're entitled to the time. And if they're within that window, the 48 or 72 hours, you can't retaliate by discipline. Let me see if I have anything else here. Okay, if the employee lives in the city of Pittsburgh or Allegheny County but doesn't work there, do you have to provide the time? No, it's only where they work, not where they live. Let me see if I have anything else here. With PTO, people use time for many things. Do I have to separate the 72 hours out? No, what we're looking for is, would the 72 hours be available for any of the reasons under here? So the fact that I use it because I decided to go to the Bahamas, I still had it available for the sick time had I chosen to use it wisely. The fact that I didn't and I went to the Bahamas instead, you front loaded the time, you allowed me to use it for any of the reasons under the sun in these ordinances, in the increments and with the notice provisions. If you've done all that and I use it foolishly, or for the Bahamas, I don't know if that's foolish or not, you don't have to start parsing it out and saying, well, hey, we're going to give her more time because she used the first 2 weeks for the Bahamas. That's not how this works. Once you have front loaded the right amount of time for the right reasons and the right increments, et cetera, you have met your obligation. Okay. Somebody said, thanks for answering all our questions on the complex topics. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Everybody who has said thank you, you are most welcome. We had a lot of attendees and some fantastic questions, so I appreciate that. One more question has just come in. To confirm, this applies after the employee has worked 90 days. So they start accruing on day 1 of employment, but they can't use it until the 90th day. So I hope that clarifies. Other than that, thank you, everybody. Go enjoy this beautiful day and try to stay cool out there. I hope everybody attends Narcisi Winery. Come for the drinks. It's a beautiful winery. Don't come for me. I'll just be babbling about some HR topic. But come for the drinks and the snacks. It'll be great. Take care, everyone.